Welcome to Stillness Audiobook. You're listening to a selection from The Weight You Don't Have to Carry by Camille Ella, from the Essays for the Human Being series. This audiobook features 6 essays from the first book in the series, written for moments when life feels heavy in quiet ways. Not because something is wrong, but because too much has been held for too long. These essays are not instructions. They are not answers. They are gentle reflections on the emotional weight we accumulate without noticing, and the possibility of setting some of it down. You don't need to listen closely. You don't need to take notes. You don't need to arrive anywhere by the end. This is simply an invitation to slow your breathing, soften your thoughts, and allow the words to move at their own pace. Take your time. You are listening to The Weight You Don't Have to Carry, from the Essays for the Human Being series by Camille Ella, here on Stillness Audiobook. Let's begin. Essay 1. The Inheritance of Invisible Burdens. There are weights a person carries without ever remembering the day. They pick them up. They settle somewhere between the chest and the quiet parts of the mind, forming a heaviness that feels familiar, almost natural, even if it was never meant to belong to them. Most people grow up believing these burdens are simply part of being alive. They assume everyone walks through life with the same tightness in the ribs, the same pressure behind their thoughts, the same unspoken responsibility to hold everything together. But burdens have origins, even the invisible ones. Most of them begin long before we understand what they truly mean. A look that lasted a moment too long. A sentence said by an adult who was too overwhelmed to realize its impact. The quiet expectation that you stay strong, stay calm, stay composed, stay agreeable. The feeling that your role in a room is to absorb the atmosphere instead of shaping it. The slow, subtle instruction that says, you must not fail. You must not disappoint. You must not be the reason anything becomes harder than it already is. This is how the inheritance begins. Not through dramatic events, but through countless small signals that teach a child they must carry more than their share. Some people inherit fear. Not loud fear, but the kind that whispers warnings before anything even goes wrong. Some inherit shame, a soft but persistent sense that they must earn their place in every room. Some inherit responsibility, the kind that makes them feel older than they are, long before anyone notices. And many inherit silence. A silence that tells them their emotions are secondary, inconvenient, or better kept inside. No, one chooses these inheritances. They simply appear, woven into the early years like shadows that follow you wherever you go. As adults, these burdens become so familiar that it's hard to imagine life without them. If you've spent years holding everything together for everyone else, the idea of letting go feels almost irresponsible. If you've always been the calm one, the reasonable one, the dependable one, releasing even a small part of that weight feels like breaking an unspoken contract. And yet there's a truth that becomes clearer the longer you look at these burdens. Most of what you carry is not actually yours, but you carried it anyway because, at the time, you believed you had to. You believed that being needed meant being valuable. You believed that staying quiet meant keeping the peace. You believed that appearing strong meant protecting the people around you. You believed that caring more was the only way to avoid being a burden yourself. This is how invisible weights settle into place, through beliefs you never consciously agreed to. And the difficult part is this. The moment you inherit a burden, you begin building your identity around it. You start making decisions based on it. You shape your relationships around it. You choose your words carefully, your tone carefully, your actions carefully, all to protect something that should never have been yours to protect. This is why it's so hard to put these burdens down later. They're tangled into the way you move through the world. They influence how you measure your worth, how you respond to conflict, how you hold yourself in moments of uncertainty. But something powerful happens once you begin noticing the burden itself. Awareness is the first crack in its foundation. You start asking quiet questions. Why do I feel responsible for everyone's comfort? Why do I apologize so quickly, even when nothing is my fault? Why do I tense up when someone raises their voice? Why do I feel guilty resting? Why do I carry the emotions of others as if they are my own? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are the first signs of waking up. They signal the beginning of a truth many people never reach. You do not have to carry everything you inherited. Some weights can be understood, some can be laid down gently, and some can be released entirely. Once you recognize that their origins had nothing to do with who you are, only with where you came from, there comes a point in every person's life when the familiar heaviness begins to feel less like identity and more like a question. You sense that something in you is tired in a way that rest alone cannot fix. A weariness that sits behind your eyes, in your thoughts, in the way you tell yourself, "It's fine, I can handle it," even when a quieter part of you whispers that you cannot. This is usually the moment when people start to wonder where the burden began. They look back, not for blame, but for understanding. And understanding is what lifts the first layer of weight. Often, you will find that the burdens you carry were passed down through people who were carrying their own. A parent who pushed you to excel because no one ever believed in them. A guardian who taught you to stay quiet because their own childhood didn't allow noise. A teacher who demanded perfection because they were terrified of being judged. A family member who relied on you emotionally because they had no one else. You inherited their fears the way people inherit old furniture. Not because it suited you, but because it was there. Burden is generational. So is silence. So is the internal pressure to be the one who holds everything together. When you begin to understand this, you start to see that carrying these weights was never a personal failure. It was a story handed to you long before you were old enough to choose your own. And this is where something important begins. You realize you are allowed to question the storyline. You are allowed to ask whether belief belongs to you or to someone who once taught you how to survive in an environment that no longer exists. You are allowed to ask whether being strong all the time has truly helped you or simply kept you from being seen. You are allowed to ask what parts of your identity were built from fear instead of truth. These questions are not acts of rebellion. They are acts of reclamation, reclaiming your emotional space, reclaiming your voice, reclaiming the right to feel without apologizing, reclaiming the life that exists outside the expectations others placed on you. What many people don't realize is that letting go of an invisible burden is not dramatic. It is not a sudden epiphany or a sweeping transformation. It is a slow, steady shift in how you treat yourself. It happens in moments so quiet that no one else notices. The moment you choose rest without guilt. The moment you say no without explaining yourself. The moment you allow yourself to cry instead of swallowing the feeling. The moment you admit you're tired instead of pretending you're fine. The moment you let someone else help you, even if it feels unfamiliar. These moments may look small, but they are profound. They mark the beginning of a new identity. One built not on inherited expectations, but on truth. And here is the most freeing part. Every burden you inherited has an expiration date, the moment you recognize it is not yours. Awareness loosens it. Compassion softens it. Clarity allows you to set it down. The weight you carried for years can become something you outgrow, not something you fight. Because the truth is, you were never meant to spend your whole life proving your worth. You were never meant to be the emotional anchor for everyone you love. You were never meant to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You were never meant to carry the grief, fears, and expectations of people who never learned how to carry their own. The moment you understand this is the moment you start returning to yourself. There's a version of you that existed before the burdens, and that version is still there, patient, hopeful, waiting for the day you decide to stop holding what was never yours. There is a quiet courage in acknowledging the weight you've been carrying, not the loud, heroic kind people celebrate, but a softer courage that happens inside your mind when no one else is watching. It's the courage of looking inward and admitting that something feels heavier than it should. It's the courage of facing your own exhaustion without minimizing it. Most people avoid this moment because they are afraid of what they might find. They worry that if they examine their burdens too closely, they will discover that they are the reason for their own suffering. But the deeper truth is that examining these weights often reveals the opposite. You were trying your best in an environment that didn't make room for your needs. This is why compassion, especially self-compassion, is essential when exploring your burdens. Without it, you will judge yourself for carrying too much. With it, you will understand that you carried what you believed you had to. Compassion does not erase the past, but it softens the grip it has on your present. When you treat yourself gently, something shifts. You see the younger version of you, the one who started carrying these weights with a kind of tenderness you never had before. You begin to understand the difficult truth that most people discover only later in life. You carry invisible burdens not because you are weak, but because you learned early on that carrying them kept the world around you stable. You carried emotions that didn't belong to you because someone needed you to be steady. You carried responsibility beyond your age because you thought it would hold your family together. You carried silence because speaking up felt unsafe. You carried high expectations because someone convinced you that your value depended on being extraordinary. Over time, you learned to build your life around these weights. They shaped your choices, your relationships, your boundaries, and even the way you interpreted rejection or conflict. Burdens have a way of influencing everything, even if they remain unnamed. This is why the first step in letting go is not release. It is recognition. You cannot set down a weight you have not yet acknowledged. You cannot loosen a burden whose shape you have never examined. But once you see it for what it is, an inheritance, not a definition, you gain the power to decide what to do next. And here is the truth that many people never realize. Letting go of a burden is not the same as letting go of the people who gave it to you. This distinction matters. You can love your family deeply and still release the expectations they taught you. You can care for your parents and still decline the emotional roles they placed upon you. You can value your relationships and still refuse to be the person who absorbs every conflict or disappointment. You can understand someone's pain and still choose not to make it your own. Letting go is not abandonment. It is self-alignment. It is choosing what is yours to hold and what is not. It is recognizing that responsibility has limits, and those limits protect your emotional well-being. It is learning that you are allowed to support others without sacrificing yourself. Once you understand this, an internal shift begins. You start to see that strength is not measured by how much you can carry, but by how wisely you choose your burdens. You start to realize that you cannot build a meaningful life if your arms are full of weights that originated in someone else's story. The process of releasing inherited burdens is gradual. It does not happen in one moment of clarity. It happens in many small choices, repeated over time, as you learn to value your inner peace more than the roles you were trained to play. And with each choice, the weight becomes lighter. As the weight begins to loosen, something unexpected happens. You start to hear yourself more clearly, not the voice shaped by years of responsibility or the voice that learned to stay quiet for the sake of peace, but the voice underneath all of it, the one that was always yours. It does not speak loudly. It does not compete. It simply waits. It waits for the moment you decide that your needs matter. It waits for the moment you choose rest without apology. It waits for the moment you pause long enough to hear what you actually feel, instead of what you think you're supposed to feel. This voice often feels unfamiliar in the beginning, when you have spent years shaping yourself around the needs of others. Listening to your own truth feels almost selfish. But slowly, you learn that honoring yourself is not selfishness. It is responsibility of a different kind. A responsibility to your emotional well-being, to your growth, to your future. And here is the surprising part. When you stop carrying inherited burdens, you become more present to the people you love, not less. You become clearer, more honest, more grounded, more emotionally available, because your energy is no longer consumed by holding what was never yours. Letting go does not make you distant. It makes you real. The people who truly care for you will notice the difference. They will see you breathing easier. They will see you becoming softer with yourself, more patient, more sincere. They will notice that your presence feels warmer, freer, more authentic. They might not understand what changed, but they will feel it. And those who relied on your burdens to keep their world stable, they may struggle, not because you're doing something wrong, but because they were accustomed to you carrying more than your share. Sometimes people grow attached to the version of you that exists for their comfort. But you are not responsible for managing other people's expectations of who you should be. You are responsible only for becoming the person you truly are. This transition can feel lonely at first. When you place a burden down, there is an emptiness where the weight used to be. Not a painful emptiness, but an unfamiliar one. A space that feels bare because it used to be full of things you carried for years. Give yourself permission to grow into that space. Give yourself permission to breathe differently. Give yourself permission to rest in a life that no longer asks you to perform strength at the cost of your emotional health. There will come a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when you realize you do not miss the weight. You do not miss the pressure. You do not miss the version of yourself who believed that value was measured by endurance. Instead, you will feel something else rising in its place. A sense of self that is no longer shaped by fear or expectation. A clarity that comes from recognizing what truly belongs to you. A lightness that comes from choosing truth over inheritance. This is not the end of your healing. It is the beginning of having enough space within yourself to finally grow. What you discover, slowly and gently, is that the act of releasing inherited burdens is not about forgetting the past. It is about understanding how the past shaped you, and then choosing which parts of it still deserve space in your life. You cannot change what you were given, but you can decide what you keep. This choice becomes a kind of wisdom. You begin to see that some of the beliefs that once guided you were built from someone else's fear, not your truth. You start noticing how often you shrink yourself to avoid conflict, how quickly you offer comfort even when you need it yourself. How instinctively you blame yourself when something goes wrong. You begin to trace each of these habits back to their origins, not to dwell there, but to understand. Understanding is powerful. It transforms what once felt heavy into something that can be set down with intention. And once you set down even a part of that weight, something extraordinary happens. Your life begins to move differently. Not louder, not faster, but with a new kind of steadiness. You notice connections becoming more honest, decisions becoming clearer, boundaries becoming easier to draw. Your mind becomes quieter in ways you did not know were possible. This is the life that emerges when you stop carrying what was never yours. It is not a life without challenges. Everyone faces their share, but the challenges are yours to navigate, not inherited scripts replaying themselves through your choices. You no longer react out of old wounds. You no longer abandon yourself to earn love. You no longer confuse being needed with being valued. You learn to exist without the extra weight. You learn to breathe without bracing. You learn to love without losing yourself. And most importantly, you learn to choose the burdens you carry instead of carrying everything by default. Some burdens are meant to stay, like responsibility, integrity, the effort required to grow, the courage needed to face difficult truths. These are the weights that strengthen you, the ones that belong to your future instead of your past. But the rest, the shame, the inherited fear, the silent expectations, the roles you never agreed to, you are allowed to release every one of them. This is the inheritance you give yourself when you stop accepting the one handed to you. A life that reflects who you truly are, not who you were taught to be. A life defined by clarity instead of pressure, by choice instead of obligation, by self-understanding instead of silent endurance. You may not notice the transformation at first. It will not announce itself. It will not arrive in a dramatic moment. It will unfold slowly, in quiet decisions, in gentle realizations, in the way you speak to yourself when no one else can hear. You will know you've grown when the burdens you once carried feel heavy again, not because you've gotten weaker, but because you finally understand that they were never meant to be yours. And that understanding is the first freedom, the beginning of a life where you walk lighter, think clearer, and stand in the truth of who you are becoming. Essay 2. The expectations that quietly shape us. There are expectations we agree to, and then there are expectations we silently absorb without realizing they've become part of how we measure our worth. The second kind is far more powerful. They slip into your life unnoticed, shaping how you think, how you act, and how you understand yourself long before you have the language to describe what is happening. Every person grows up surrounded by expectations. Some are spoken out loud, many are not. You learn them by observing how people react, by noticing what earns approval and what earns disapproval, by sensing the atmosphere of a room before you even understand why. You learn to read people's faces before you learn to read books. You learn to adjust your behavior before you know what boundaries are. You learn to stay small in moments when you needed space to grow. You learn to stretch yourself in moments when rest would have saved you. This is the quiet architecture of expectation. It builds you from the inside out. In childhood, you rarely question these expectations because you assume they're simply the rules of the world. If the adults around you praise calmness, you try to be calm. If they reward achievements, you learn to chase them. If they respond better to silence than honesty, you start hiding your feelings even before you understand them. You adapt, not because it feels right, but because it feels necessary. Over time, these expectations become patterns. Patterns become habits. Habits become identity. And identity becomes something you cling to, even when it exhausts you. Many people don't realize how much of their adult life is shaped by expectations they absorbed so early they were never aware of the moment they agreed to them. The expectation to always be capable. The expectation to never disappoint. The expectation to be agreeable, calm, composed, pleasant. The expectation to succeed without ever showing how much effort it required. The expectation to be strong even when you desperately need softness. These expectations are not taught in a single moment. They grow quietly, accumulating like dust on a surface you forget to notice. And because they arrive slowly, you rarely question whether they were meant for you. What makes these expectations even heavier is that they often originate from people who are doing their best with what they had. A parent who pushed you to achieve because they wanted a better life for you. A teacher who praised perfection because they believed it meant potential. A caregiver who discouraged emotional expression because they never learned how to handle their own. They weren't trying to limit you. They were repeating patterns handed to them by the people who shaped them. But even well-intentioned expectations can become burdens when they do not match the truth of who you are. Part of growing up is learning the difference between what was taught to you and what is actually yours. It is choosing which expectations you still want to carry and which ones have quietly taken too much from you. This is the work of reclaiming your inner world, not by rejecting your past, but by understanding how it shaped you. One of the most revealing moments in adulthood is when you begin to notice how often your choices are influenced by expectations you never consciously agreed to. You start to see how deeply these silent rules have carved paths through your life. You notice it when you say yes, even though your entire body wants to say no. You notice it when you hide your exhaustion because you fear being seen as less capable. You notice it when you feel unworthy of rest, unless you've earned it through productivity. You notice it when you apologize for things that do not require an apology. You notice it when you downplay your needs because you learned long ago that your comfort should come second. These are the subtle traces of expectation, the way they shape your instincts before your reasoning even has a chance to speak. And many people spend years living this way without ever realizing that they are not responding to their true desires, but to script written long ago by someone else's hopes, fears, and misunderstandings. What makes unspoken expectations so powerful is that they blend with your sense of self. They masquerade as your own thoughts. They whisper in your mind using your voice. They convince you that you are choosing freely, even when you're following an internal rule that was never yours. For example, the expectation to be strong often sounds like, I shouldn't need help. If I struggle, it means I'm failing. No one else seems overwhelmed. I should be able to handle this. But beneath these thoughts is a deeper story, one you were not old enough to analyze when it began. A story that said being independent made you valuable, being emotional made you inconvenient, and being vulnerable made you a liability. Over time, this story became a quiet law you lived by. Another common expectation is the pressure to please. It may sound like, I don't want to upset anyone. It's easier if I stay quiet. Let me fix this before it becomes a problem. But behind this is often an early lesson. Peace depends on your compliance. Approval is safer than conflict. Your worth is tied to your ability to make others comfortable, even when it costs you your own comfort. The problem with these expectations is not that they existed. Many expectations are meant to guide and protect. The problem is that no one teaches you how to reevaluate them once you grow up. No one tells you that expectations meant for a child may not be suitable for the adult you're becoming. Everyone outgrows the person they had to be in childhood, but not everyone realizes they're allowed to let go of the expectations that shaped that version of themselves. This is why self-awareness feels like both a relief and a rebellion. You begin to see that the rules you've lived by are not laws, but impressions left by the people who raised you, taught you, guided you, or influenced you. They were human, imperfect, and shaped by their own invisible pressures. You inherit expectations the same way you inherit behaviors, mannerisms, and patterns. But the moment you recognize an expectation, you gain the power to step outside of it. And this is where the discomfort begins, because stepping outside someone else's expectation often feels like betraying them, even when it is an act of loyalty to yourself. You begin to question what it means to live your own life instead of the one others implicitly designed for you. You start to ask whether the standards you chase are truly yours or simply familiar. You start noticing how often your decisions are driven by fear of disappointing people who may not even remember placing those expectations on you. This is not an easy stage. It requires honesty. It requires courage. It requires a willingness to feel temporarily lost while you shed the identity built on meeting unspoken demands. But what you gain from this process is worth the discomfort. A relationship with yourself grounded in clarity rather than obligation. There is a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when you begin to sense that your life has been shaped more by expectations than by intention. It does not arrive dramatically. It shows up in small realizations that accumulate until you can no longer ignore them. You feel it when you hesitate to express an opinion because you fear it might disrupt the atmosphere. You feel it when you celebrate an achievement but still worry it wasn't impressive enough. You feel it when you agree to responsibilities you no longer have the energy for. You feel it when you stay composed even though your inner world is trembling. These moments reveal something important, that the expectations you absorb became internal rules you follow automatically, long after the circumstances that shaped them have passed. This is why so many people feel a strange tension in adulthood, the kind that makes them wonder, why do I still act this way? The truth is simple. You are no longer the person who needed those expectations, but the expectations never updated themselves. They linger. They persist. They remain in place because they have not been questioned. And questioning them can feel like stepping into unfamiliar ground, not because the truth is dangerous, but because the identity built around meeting expectations feels safer than the identity waiting on the other side of honesty. But the question that eventually comes is this: what do you truly want? Not what you were trained to want, not what makes others proud, not what maintains harmony, not what keeps you acceptable, respectable, or predictable. What do you want? For many people, this question is unsettling because they never learned to ask it. They learned to pursue the goals others applauded. They learned to avoid the choices others criticized. They learned to think of desire as something that needed permission. Wanting became something to earn, not something to explore. And so, the first time you ask yourself what you truly want, there is often silence. Not because there is no answer, but because the answer has been buried under years of trying to be exactly what others expected you to be. This silence is not a problem. It is a beginning. It is a moment of truth that signals the foundation of your life is shifting. It means you are ready to stop living through reflex and start living through awareness. What follows this stage is not rebellion, but discovery. You begin to notice small desires rising to the surface. Desires that used to feel impractical, inconvenient, or unreasonable. The desire to rest without justification. The desire to express yourself without filtering every sentence. The desire to protect your time instead of giving it away, reflexively. The desire to choose relationships based on connection, not obligation. The desire to create a life that reflects your values instead of your programming. These desires are not selfish. They are signals that your true self is resurfacing. But as you start listening to yourself, you may also notice something else. Guilt. The guilt of not meeting an expectation you once carried effortlessly. The guilt of disappointing someone who relied on your compliance. The guilt of choosing your well-being over your role in someone else's stability. The guilt of walking a path that diverges from what others imagine for you. This guilt is natural, but it is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It is simply the tension that arises when old expectations collide with new truth. And truth, when listened to long enough, becomes stronger than expectation. It teaches you that you do not need to earn rest. You do not need to justify your boundaries. You do not need to shape yourself to fit someone else's idea of who you should be. You do not need to sacrifice your inner peace to maintain approval. The more you learn this, the more you realize how many expectations were based on fear rather than love. Fear of being judged, fear of being abandoned, fear of being misunderstood, fear of causing trouble, fear of not being enough. When you begin releasing these fears, you also release the expectations built upon them. There is a shift that happens once you begin to understand the expectations that shaped you. At first, the shift feels almost invisible. A subtle awareness, a quiet pause before you respond, a moment of hesitation before you automatically agree to something. But over time, this awareness gathers strength. It becomes the space where choice lives. You begin to realize that you are allowed to step back before reacting. You are allowed to question whether a request fits your energy. You are allowed to wonder whether a responsibility truly belongs to you. You are allowed to consider whether a certain version of yourself is still honest. This space, this pause, is the beginning of self-governance. Expectations lose their power the moment you recognize that you have the right to choose differently. You are not obligated to remain the person people assume you are. You are not required to maintain the story others have written for you. And you are not bound to the roles that once made sense but no longer reflect your truth. In this new space, even small decisions begin to feel different. You decide to speak a little more honestly, even if your voice shakes at first. You decide to decline obligations that drain you, not out of rebellion, but out of self-respect. You decide to let people see your humanity instead of performing capability. You decide to listen to your discomfort instead of pushing it aside. These decisions may look ordinary from the outside, but they represent a profound internal shift. They mark the moment when your life stops being built on inherited expectations and starts being built on conscious intention. And intention, unlike expectation, allows room for growth. But growth also comes with tension. When you begin to change, the people around you may not understand immediately. Some will adjust with you. Others may struggle, not because your growth harms them, but because it asks them to see you in a new way. When someone has grown comfortable with your predictability, your newfound honesty can unsettle them. When someone has relied on your compliance, your boundaries may feel unexpected. When someone has benefited from your silence, your voice may surprise them. This discomfort is not a sign that you should stop growing. It is simply part of the transition. Every meaningful change in your life will affect the way others respond to you. Some will welcome it, some may resist, but neither reaction should determine your direction. The deeper truth is that expectations lose their influence when you stop organizing your life around the fear of disappointing others. When you recognize that your worth is not measured by the roles you fulfill or the standards you meet, but by the integrity of your relationship with yourself. This clarity is freeing, but it is also sobering. It reveals how much of your life was shaped by silent pressure. Pressure that felt like love, responsibility, or duty, but was often a response to someone else's wounds. When you begin letting go of these expectations, you do not reject the people who shaped you. You simply stop abandoning yourself for their sake. What remains is a gentler, truer relationship with yourself. One built not on fear of failing expectations, but on the desire to understand your own needs, your own voice, your own path. This is the beginning of living from the inside out instead of the outside in. When the expectations that shaped you begin to loosen, life doesn't suddenly become lighter, at least not in the beginning. What emerges first is a quiet awareness, a sense that you are no longer moving through the world blindly following a script you inherited. Instead, you begin to write your own. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is gradual, steady, and deeply internal. It's a soft awakening, the kind that happens over months or even years, as you unlearn what no longer fits and reconnect with parts of yourself that were hidden beneath layers of performance. One day you notice that you are no longer rushing to fill every silence. Another day you realize you did not apologize for something that wasn't your fault. Later, you find yourself saying no, without rehearsing an explanation. Eventually, you speak a truth that once felt too risky to express. These small acts mark the beginning of becoming who you actually are, not who you were expected to be. As this happens, your inner world changes. You start asking different questions, not the ones shaped by fear or responsibility, but the ones shaped by curiosity, longing, and honest self-inquiry. What feels meaningful to me? What brings me peace? What drains me more than it should? Where do I feel most like myself? What kind of life feels like a home rather than a performance? These questions lead you back to your true identity, the one that existed before expectation molded it, before fear influenced it, before approval shaped it. And once you reconnect with that identity, you begin to understand something essential. You were never meant to live a life built entirely on roles you didn't choose. People can guide you, they can influence you, they can inspire you or discipline you or shape you to a point. But the responsibility of shaping your life ultimately belongs to you. This realization might arrive with sadness at first. You may grieve the years you spent carrying expectations that felt heavier than your own desires. You may mourn the moments when you silence yourself to be accepted, or the times you abandoned your needs to fulfill someone else's idea of who you should be. Grief is natural. It is the recognition of what you lost while trying so hard to be what others needed. But once the grief softens, what remains is clarity. You begin to see that the expectations you inherited were never obligations. They were starting points. You can honor the people who shaped you without limiting your future to the roles they imagined for you. You can appreciate where you came from without allowing it to dictate where you are going. And this is the true power of recognizing the expectations that shaped you. You reclaim your ability to define your own life. A life guided by intention rather than habit. A life shaped by awareness rather than automatic compliance. A life rooted in the truth of who you're becoming, not the person you once had to be. The expectations that once felt permanent lose their authority the moment you decide to choose yourself. Not selfishly, not recklessly, but honestly. And when you choose yourself gently, consistently, with respect, the world does not fall apart. It rearranges itself. It makes space for you. It learns to meet the version of you that is no longer held together by fear, pressure, or the quiet need to be who others expect you to be. This is the beginning of a new kind of freedom, Not the freedom to escape, but the freedom to live with intention. Not the freedom to reject your past, but the freedom to move beyond its boundaries. Not the freedom to disappoint others, but the freedom to honor yourself. You do not need to live a life written by expectations. You are allowed to write a life shaped by truth. Essay 3. The fear of disappointing the people we love. There is a particular kind of fear that begins early in life and stays with many people far longer than they realize. It is not the fear of failure, rejection, or uncertainty. It is quieter than that, softer, more deeply woven into the way a person thinks about themselves. It is the fear of disappointing someone they love. This fear does not shout. It whispers. It shapes choices before they are fully formed. It pulls you toward behaviors that feel safe and away from truths that feel risky. It teaches you to measure your worth through the eyes of the people who mean the most to you. And because it forms so early, it rarely feels like fear. It feels like responsibility. It feels like loyalty. It feels like love. You grow up learning to read the moods of the people around you. You notice which actions earn praise, which comments create tension, which mistakes bring disappointment. You learn to avoid the things that trigger disapproval, and you learn to do more of the things that earn affection or pride. If someone smiled when you behaved sensibly, you tried to be sensible. If they praised you when you achieved something, you chased achievement. If they were quieter or colder when you expressed strong emotions, you learned to hide those emotions. If they expected you to be the reliable one, you kept being reliable, even when it cost you your own rest. Little by little, you begin to build your identity around who others needed you to be, not because they demanded it harshly, but because their approval felt like safety. And safety is a powerful teacher. The fear of disappointing loved ones becomes so deeply ingrained that you begin to equate disappointing them with losing them. Even when you logically know that is not true, the emotional memory tells a different story. So you shape yourself carefully, cautiously, always considering how your decisions will affect the people whose opinions you hold close. You stay small to avoid being criticized. You overextend yourself to avoid being seen as selfish. You hide your real feelings to avoid causing worry. You downplay your struggles to avoid being a burden. You say yes more than you want to. You say no far less than you need to. And the whole time, you quietly wonder why everything feels so heavy. The truth is that the fear of disappointing someone you love can be one of the heaviest emotional burdens you carry. Not because the love is wrong, but because you learn to treat love as a performance instead of a relationship. Love becomes something you earn. Approval becomes something you protect. Honesty becomes something you ration. Authenticity becomes something you hide. This fear shapes you without ever announcing itself. It influences how you behave in relationships, how you work, how you communicate, how you ask for help, and how you express your needs. Over time, it can become so automatic that you mistake it for your personality. Many people believe they're naturally selfless, naturally agreeable, naturally strong, naturally supportive, when in reality, they learned to be these things because it made the people around them feel comfortable, and comfort felt safer than truth. But the deeper truth is this. The fear of disappointing others is often rooted in the belief that your worth depends on pleasing them. And that belief did not originate in adulthood. It began long before you had the words to challenge it. As you grow older, the fear of disappointing others becomes harder to distinguish from genuine care. You tell yourself you're being thoughtful. You tell yourself you're being responsible. You tell yourself it's normal to worry about how your choices affect the people around you. And in many ways, it is normal. Caring about others is part of being human, but there is a difference between caring with freedom and caring with fear. Freedom allows you to love without losing yourself. Fear convinces you that love must be protected by self-sacrifice. This fear becomes especially powerful when it blends with admiration. When you admire someone deeply, a parent, mentor, partner, or friend, disappointing them feels like failing a part of yourself. Their pride becomes a kind of mirror. You look into it to see who you are. You stay near it to feel worthy. This makes disappointment feel dangerous, even when no one has threatened you with loss. Many people carry this fear silently. They rarely talk about it because it feels embarrassing to admit that someone else's opinion has that much influence over their choices. But silence only reinforces the fear. It turns a passing thought into a hidden rule, a rule you obey without recognizing its cost. And it does have a cost. The cost is felt in the goals you choose or avoid, the relationships you stay in or stay out of, the emotions you suppress or express in carefully managed doses, the dreams you shrink, the truths you soften, the boundaries you avoid drawing. You start shaping every decision around a single unspoken question. Will this make someone I love disappointed in me? This question sounds noble. It even sounds selfless. But beneath it lies a deeper emotional pattern. You are protecting your connection by erasing small parts of yourself. One choice at a time, one silence at a time, one suppressed desire at a time. The fear becomes so subtle that you don't notice how it guides your behavior in moments big and small. You avoid conflicts not because you agree, but because you fear upsetting someone. You pursue paths that feel acceptable, not necessarily meaningful. You pretend to be fine because you fear being seen as weak. You stay agreeable even when something hurts. You stay composed because you fear being judged for unraveling. And each time you override your inner truth, the fear grows stronger. Not because the people you love are punishing you, but because you're punishing yourself for imagining their disappointment. This is the part few people talk about. Most of the fear of disappointing others comes from assumptions, not reality. You imagine the disappointment before it happens. You imagine the criticism before anyone speaks. You imagine losing love before anyone threatens it. You rehearse their reactions in your mind until they become more powerful than the actual people you love. This is how fear distorts relationships. It doesn't just influence how you act. It influences how you interpret everything. A neutral comment feels like judgment. A moment of silence feels like disapproval. A suggestion feels like a correction. A disagreement feels like rejection. An expectation feels like a test. And the saddest part is this. The people you love might have no idea that you live this way. They might not know you carry this pressure. They might not know that their smallest reactions can echo inside you for hours or days. They might not know that your fear of disappointing them has shaped your life more than their love ever intended. This fear isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of how deeply you care. But caring deeply should never mean disappearing quietly. There comes a moment when the fear becomes too quiet to ignore, not because it suddenly grows louder, but because you begin to see the shape of your life more clearly. You start noticing the spaces where your truth should be, but isn't. You begin hearing the thoughts you avoid saying out loud. You start feeling the tension between who you are and who you've been trying to be. This tension is not a crisis. It is a calling. It is the part of you that wants to live honestly pulling against the part of you that learns safety through compliance. In this moment, you may begin to question your own patterns. You may ask yourself why certain conversations feel uncomfortable, why certain decisions bring anxiety, why certain situations make you shrink even when you're capable of expanding. These questions are signs that you are beginning to outgrow the fear. But outgrowing fear is not the same as rejecting love. It is understanding that love does not require you to betray yourself. Still, the process is not simple. It often brings up a kind of internal conflict, a quiet struggle between your desire to be seen and your desire to be acceptable. You may find yourself caught between two truths. You want to be honest. You want to be loved. And somewhere along the way, you learn to believe you cannot have both. This belief is one of the deepest roots of the fear of disappointing others. It teaches you that love must be preserved through perfection, sacrifice, or emotional suppression. But the longer you live with this belief, the more you start to realize its consequences. You notice how certain parts of yourself have dimmed. You notice how often you filter your thoughts. You notice how your relationships feel slightly tilted, as if one part of you is always bending. And eventually, you begin to question whether this bending is truly necessary. One of the most profound realizations you will ever reach is this. People who love you want your truth, not your performance. They may not always respond perfectly. They may need time to adjust. They may need to learn who you are beneath the layers of caution you wore for so long. But love that depends on your silence is not love that nourishes you. It takes courage to test this truth. It takes courage to speak without cushioning your honesty. It takes courage to make a decision based on your needs instead of someone else's expectations. It takes courage to let people see you in moments when you feel vulnerable or uncertain. But this courage is the slow unraveling of fear. As you practice this courage, you begin to discover something unexpected. The world does not fall apart when you stop protecting everyone from disappointment. The relationships meant to stay will stretch and grow around your truth. The people capable of loving you will learn to meet you where you are. The people who value your presence will appreciate the honesty that comes with your growth. The fear that once felt immovable begins to soften when you realize that your worth does not depend on being unproblematic, flawless, convenient, or endlessly capable. You begin to understand that love expands when honesty enters the room. You begin to see that connection deepens when you stop hiding your needs. You begin to feel the quiet relief of no longer shaping your entire identity around who others expect you to be. This is not a rejection of the people you love. It is an invitation for them to know who you truly are. And the parts of you that dimmed in the name of harmony, they begin to return, slowly, bravely, fully. There is a particular kind of relief that arrives when you begin letting yourself be seen without the careful filtering you once relied on. It isn't loud. It isn't immediate. It doesn't arrive with triumph. Instead, it comes quietly, in small realizations that settle slowly into your awareness. You notice it the first time you admit you're tired, and someone responds with understanding instead of disappointment. You notice it when you say what you feel, and the conversation becomes softer instead of tense. You notice it when you ask for help, and the world does not collapse. You notice it when you choose a different path, and the people who truly care remain beside you. These moments reveal something essential. The fear of disappointing others is often far larger in your imagination than in reality. Fear tends to amplify possibilities. Love tends to meet you where you are. But because the fear began when you were young, your mind learned to treat disappointment as a threat, something that could jeopardize your safety, belonging, or place in the world. Even in adulthood, the younger part of you carries this memory. It is not immaturity. It is survival instinct. This is why releasing the fear requires gentleness, not force. You cannot shame yourself into bravery. You cannot rush your way into authenticity. You cannot expect years of self-protection to unravel overnight. Healing this fear happens in layers. The first layer is awareness, seeing the fear for what it is. The second is honesty, admitting how much of your life it has shaped. The third is experimentation, small acts of truth that test the strength of your connections. The fourth is trust, learning to believe that love can hold your imperfections. The fifth is integration, living in a way that no longer treats disappointment as danger. None of these steps are linear. Some days you will feel free. Some days you will slip back into old habits of pleasing, apologizing, and shrinking. This is not failure. It is evidence that you are healing something deep. And healing something deep requires time. Along the way, you begin to unlearn a powerful misconception that disappointing someone means you have done something wrong. In reality, disappointment is a normal part of human relationships. You will disappoint people. They will disappoint you. This is not rejection. It is the natural friction that occurs when two lives, two desires, and two truths coexist. You begin to realize that avoiding disappointment comes at a higher cost than facing it. Avoiding it costs you authenticity. Avoiding it costs you your voice. Avoiding it costs you your dreams. Avoiding it costs you the connection that comes from being fully known. Facing disappointment, on the other hand, leads to something much more meaningful. Relationships build on truth rather than performance. This is the part most people discover only later in life. That real closeness does not come from being perfect or predictable. It comes from being human. It comes from letting others see you in your uncertainty, messiness, desire, confusion, hope, and truth. And when you finally allow yourself to be this human, not polished, not curated, not pleasing, you begin to feel a quiet strength that was always yours but never fully accessed. A strength that says, you can love people deeply without abandoning yourself. You can disappoint someone and still be worthy of love. You can express a boundary without losing connection. You can be honest without being unkind. You can be imperfect and still be enough. This realization marks a turning point. The moment when love stops being a performance and becomes a relationship between equals. With time, the fear that once felt impossible to confront begins to lose its power. Not because you force yourself to be fearless, but because you learn something more important. That love is not as fragile as you once believed. Real love can withstand honesty. Real connection can survive imperfection. Real relationships can evolve when truth enters the room. You begin to trust this more as you practice letting yourself be human. You speak your feelings even when your voice is quiet. You choose your own needs without drowning in guilt. You create boundaries that allow you to stay whole. You let people see the parts of you that are still growing. You stop apologizing for simply being yourself. Each of these moments strengthens a part of you that once depended entirely on external approval. You start building a sense of worth that does not shift based on how satisfied others are with your choices. You begin recognizing that you are not responsible for managing the emotional reactions of every person you love. And in this recognition, you reclaim a freedom you may not have felt since childhood. The freedom to be guided by your inner truth rather than by fear. One of the most beautiful shifts that happens during this process is the way you begin to love others differently. When you stop relying on fear to maintain connection, you start relating with fairness, sincerity, and emotional balance. You no longer bend yourself into shapes that make you disappear. You no longer pretend to agree to avoid conflict. You no longer carry the emotional weight of another person's disappointment. You no longer see love as something that requires your silence. Instead, you learn to love from a place of presence rather than performance. You begin to offer honesty instead of compliance. You begin to offer clarity instead of guessing what others want. You begin to offer your real self instead of your curated self. This doesn't push people away. It brings the right people closer. Because intimacy grows where truth is allowed, not where fear dictates the rules. The relationships that endure this shift become deeper, more mature, and more authentic. The relationships that cannot endure this shift were likely built on the version of you that existed for someone else's comfort. And letting those dynamics fade is not loss, but release. And through all of this, you start to see your own heart differently. You see how long it has tried to protect you. You see how deeply it has wanted to feel accepted. You see how much of your life has been shaped by the hope of not letting anyone down. But now you also see that every person you love has their own fears, their own wounds, their own imperfections. You begin to see love not as a test you must pass, but as a connection where you can finally exhale. This is the quiet transformation that happens when you stop living under the shadow of disappointment. You begin to belong to yourself. And when you belong to yourself, love becomes something you offer freely, not cautiously. You no longer hide your truth to secure affection. You no longer silence your needs to preserve peace. You no longer fear being seen as human. You learn that disappointment is survivable. You learn that honesty is liberating. You learn that you are allowed to take up space in the lives of the people you love. You learn that your worth is not determined by your ability to always get everything right. And in this understanding, the fear that once shaped so much of your life finally begins to fade. It doesn't disappear suddenly. It softens. It loosens. It stops being the force that guides your every step. You become someone who loves deeply without losing yourself. Someone who speaks truthfully without apologizing for existing. Someone who understands that the strongest relationships are built not on perfection, but on presence. And perhaps most importantly, you become someone who no longer fears disappointing others, because you are finally done disappointing yourself. Essay 4. When you feel responsible for everyone's happiness. There is a certain way of moving through the world that feels natural until the day you finally question it. A way of watching people closely, sensing the smallest changes in their tone, their mood, their silences. A way of adjusting yourself, your words, your reactions, your presence, to maintain harmony in the space around you. Some people grow up thinking this is simply their personality, but more often than not, it is something learned, something inherited, something once necessary. It begins quietly. You notice when someone is upset even before they say a word. You anticipate what they need. You soften yourself to avoid adding to their stress. You take responsibility for emotions that do not belong to you. Without realizing it, you become the person who smooths tension, absorbs discomfort, and keeps everything steady. You become the stabilizer, the peacekeeper, the emotional anchor. And at first, it feels like care. It feels like kindness. It feels like being a good daughter, friend, partner, or sibling. But over time, this role becomes heavier than anything you consciously agreed to carry. When you feel responsible for everyone's happiness, your heart becomes a place where other people's storms gather. You begin to monitor every emotional shift around you as if your survival depends on it. The feelings of others become your compass, and your own feelings quietly move to the back of the line. You tell yourself you're being thoughtful. You tell yourself you're being supportive. You tell yourself that this is what love looks like. But somewhere inside you, there is a quieter truth. You are exhausted. Exhausted from predicting, soothing, fixing, absorbing. Exhausted from trying to keep people from feeling anything uncomfortable. Exhausted from believing that emotional peace depends entirely on you. The weight of this responsibility does not come from selfishness. It comes from the belief that your value lies in what you can prevent or repair. It comes from learning early on that other people's emotions have consequences, and that keeping them stable kept you safe. When this belief roots itself deeply, it creates a life where your own emotional needs feel secondary or even burdensome. You learn to hide your pain so you don't add to someone else's. You learn to manage conflict before it surfaces. You learn to pour out compassion until you're empty, and even then you try to pour a little more. This quiet self-erasure becomes a pattern, a routine, a reflex, and the world rarely notices, because when you're very good at making life smooth for others, They rarely imagine how hard it is for you. But you notice. Your body notices. Your mind notices. Your spirit notices. There will come a day when the weight becomes impossible to ignore, not because something dramatic happens, but because you finally begin to hear your own thoughts beneath the noise of everyone else's. Thoughts like, I'm tired of being the strong one. I wish someone would ask if I'm okay before I ask them. I wish I didn't feel guilty every time I disappoint someone. I want to stop being responsible for everyone's emotions. These thoughts are not signs that you are unkind or uncaring. They are signs that you are carrying more than any person should. Feeling responsible for everyone's happiness is not too much love. It is too much burden. It is the emotional equivalent of trying to keep the sky clear for everyone else, even when rain is natural and necessary. The hardest part about carrying this responsibility is that it becomes invisible even to you. You grow so accustomed to monitoring everyone else's comfort that the act of doing it feels automatic. You sense tension before anyone acknowledges it. You adjust your tone, your expressions, your choices to keep the atmosphere steady. You try to fill the spaces where someone might become upset. People call you dependable. They call you understanding. They call you mature, thoughtful, selfless. And each compliment reinforces the role you never realized you were performing. But beneath that role, there is a very different experience, one that no one sees unless they look carefully. You feel tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. You feel lonely even while being surrounded by people. You feel unseen, not because others don't care, but because you never allow yourself to need anything. You feel on edge, worried about the next moment when you must smooth something over again. You feel responsible for emotions that were never yours to carry. This kind of emotional labor creates a quiet emptiness, the kind that grows slowly and steadily until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. And when that day comes, it often feels confusing. You don't understand why you feel so drained when nothing bad has happened. You don't understand why your heart feels heavy when everyone around you seems fine. But exhaustion is what happens when you spend years being the emotional cushion for other people, when you treat every discomfort as something you must fix, when you take every sigh, silence, or change in expression personally, when you confuse empathy with obligation. Empathy is a gift. Obligation is a weight. You were meant to offer the first, not live inside the second. What makes this dynamic even more complicated is that the people around you may have come to rely on your emotional steadiness without realizing it. They might not know how much you protect them from feeling discomfort. They might not know that you absorb tension before they notice it. They might not realize you have been padding their emotional world with your own energy. It is not their fault, but it is not your responsibility either. Somewhere along the way, you stop believing that you were allowed to exist as a person with needs, boundaries, or limits. You learn to present an effortless calm even on days when your inner world felt chaotic. You learn to treat your emotional life as something that should never inconvenience anyone else. And because you were so good at it, no one questioned it, not even you. But the truth is this: you were never meant to be the source of everyone's happiness. You were never meant to regulate every mood, soften every tension, or shield everyone from discomfort. Your job is not to protect people from their own emotions. Your job is not to anticipate the needs that others never express. Your job is not to hold the emotional atmosphere together. Your job is not to perform stability to earn love. Your only job, the one that truly belongs to you, is to take responsibility for your own feelings, needs, and well-being. But when you've spent a lifetime making others your emotional priority, turning inward feels unnatural. It feels selfish. It feels wrong. Yet this discomfort is not a sign that caring for yourself is harmful. It is a sign that you're stepping outside a role that no longer fits. And stepping outside that role is the beginning of becoming someone who can love without losing themselves. One of the most important realizations you will ever come to is that protecting everyone's emotional world is not the same as being loving. Sometimes it's a form of fear. Sometimes it's a pattern built from past experiences where someone else's disappointment felt dangerous. And sometimes it's a silent attempt to earn acceptance by being endlessly reliable. Whatever the origin, the habit becomes deeply rooted. You begin to shape yourself around emotional predictions. You prepare for reactions that haven't happened. You soften your needs before they take shape. You become careful in ways that wear you down. And although you may not admit out loud, the fear underneath is simple. You don't want to be the reason someone feels hurt, frustrated, or let down. But emotional caregiving becomes blurry when you stop recognizing where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. When you feel responsible for everyone's happiness, you step into roles that are not yours. You take on weight that doesn't belong to you. You solve problems before they surface. You apologize for things beyond your control. You adapt, absorb, and adjust, often before anyone asks you to. Over time, the cost becomes clear, not because something breaks suddenly, but because you slowly lose sight of yourself. You begin noticing that your own needs feel foreign. Your preferences feel unimportant. Your voice feels quieter than you remember. Your desires feel unrealistic because you've spent so long prioritizing everyone else's. This kind of self-neglect doesn't happen all at once. It happens one small compromise at a time, one quiet apology at a time, one swallowed frustration at a time, and eventually, you wake up feeling unfamiliar to yourself, a version of you shaped more by duty than identity. The hardest part is that this pattern often forms around love. You don't want to upset the people you care about. You don't want to add stress to their already heavy lives. You don't want to be the source of conflict or disappointment. You want harmony, connection, closeness. But closeness built on self-erasure is fragile. It doesn't allow you to be fully present. It doesn't allow others to truly know you. It doesn't allow the relationship to grow, because growth requires honesty and honesty requires space. And here is the truth that feels both liberating and intimidating. You can love someone deeply and still refuse to carry their emotional world on your shoulders. You can care without performing. You can support without absorbing. You can listen without fixing. You can be present without disappearing. This kind of love is not less generous. It is more sustainable. It is rooted in respect for yourself and for the people you love, because it gives them the dignity of handling their own emotions without relying on you to manage their entire internal landscape. When you stop trying to keep everyone happy, something surprising happens. You become more authentic, more grounded, more emotionally available in a real way. You stop speaking from tension and start speaking from truth. And the right people will meet you there, not because you're perfect, but because you're no longer hiding behind a role that drained you. As you begin to loosen your grip on the responsibility you never should have carried, something starts to shift inside you. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably, you begin to realize how much of your life was spent anticipating emotions that were never yours to manage. You start to see how often you protected people from experiencing their own discomfort, and how deeply that habit shaped your relationship with yourself. You also start to see the truth that was hidden beneath all your caregiving. You have needs too. Needs you've ignored, needs you've minimized, needs you've learned to silence, so you wouldn't disrupt anyone else's peace. This is one of the most difficult realizations for someone who has spent their life making others comfortable. You don't immediately know how to recognize your own needs, let alone express them. They feel risky, heavy, or inconvenient. You're not used to thinking of yourself as someone who requires care, only as someone who provides it. So, when your needs finally rise to the surface, they often feel unfamiliar. You may feel guilty for wanting rest. You may feel selfish for wanting understanding. You may feel dramatic for wanting comfort. You may feel unworthy for wanting support. But none of these desires make you difficult. They make you human. And the people who love you deserve the chance to love the human version of you, not just the caretaker version. This shift, however, is not only about letting yourself have needs. It's also about learning a new kind of balance. When you stop holding responsibility for everyone's happiness, you don't become indifferent or distant. You don't stop caring. You don't become cold. You simply become balanced in a way that honors both sides of love, what you give and what you receive. You learn that listening does not mean fixing. You learn that kindness does not mean overextending. You learn that empathy does not mean carrying someone else's emotional weight. You learn that love does not mean sacrificing your own well-being. For the first time, you begin to see that other people are capable of handling their own emotions, even if it makes them uncomfortable. Discomfort is part of being human. Pain is part of growth. Frustration is part of learning. You were never meant to shield everyone from these experiences. When you step back from over-responsibility, you allow others to grow into their own emotional strength. You give them room to reflect, adjust, learn, and become more resilient. You stop taking away lessons that were meant for them, lessons they can only learn by facing their own feelings. And in this process, something else becomes clear. Your relationships begin to shift. They become more honest, because you are no longer pretending everything is fine. They become more respectful, because you are no longer allowing your boundaries to be invisible. They become more balanced, because you are no longer doing the emotional labor of two people. Some relationships deepen beautifully. They become stronger, healthier, more authentic. Others may struggle, not because you're doing something wrong, but because they relied on your self-sacrifice to maintain the connection. These moments feel painful, but they reveal a truth you needed to see. Relationships that depend entirely on your self-neglect are not relationships you can sustain, and you are no longer willing to lose yourself to keep the peace. In time, a quiet strength begins to grow inside you, not the kind that comes from holding everything together, but the kind that comes from finally allowing yourself to let go of what was never meant for you. This strength doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the way you breathe a little easier, in the way you pause before absorbing someone's emotions, in the way you respond with intention instead of reflex, in the way you recognize where your responsibility begins and ends. It shows up when you realize that someone's temporary disappointment is not a crisis, when you allow them to have their moment without rushing to fix it, when you acknowledge their feelings without assuming they are your fault, when you stay steady within yourself even as others navigate their own struggles. You begin to understand something essential. You were never supposed to be the emotional foundation for everyone you love. You can be loving without carrying. You can be supportive without absorbing. You can be present without rescuing. You can be kind without disappearing. This understanding marks the beginning of a new way of living, one where emotional responsibility is shared, not shouldered, where connection is maintained through truth, not sacrifice, where love is given freely because it is no longer a burden you hold alone. You start showing up differently. You make decisions based on what aligns with your well-being instead of what prevents tension. You express your feelings without rehearsing every word. You allow yourself to be cared for, not just leaned on. You give others the dignity of facing their own emotions without you stepping in to manage them. And slowly, your relationships begin to reflect this new balance. People learn to approach you with more accountability. They learn to respect your boundaries. They learn to show up for you in ways you once only did for them. They learn to see you as a full person, not a source of endless emotional stability. Some relationships will flourish in this new honesty. They will deepen, soften, and expand. Others may fade, not because you stopped caring, but because the dynamic relied on your constant self-sacrifice. Letting these relationships change is not failure. It is growth. You begin to understand that your value was never in your ability to keep everyone happy. Your worth was never measured by how much discomfort you could absorb or how effortlessly you could maintain peace. Your worth has always been rooted in who you are, your compassion, your sincerity, your inner truth, your presence. And when you stop carrying the emotional landscapes of others, you finally have the space to reclaim that truth. You feel more grounded in your decisions, more honest in your relationships, more connected to yourself, more present in your own life. You start living in a way that honors both your heart and your limits. You start loving people without abandoning yourself. You start seeing happiness as something shared, not something you are solely responsible for creating. This is the quiet liberation that comes with letting go of what was never yours to hold. It is the moment your life begins to feel like something you are living, not managing. And for the first time in a long time, you feel a gentle, steady freedom. The freedom of simply being yourself, without carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Essay 5. The Art of Letting Yourself Change. There comes a time in every person's life when the version of themselves they've been carrying no longer feels like home. It happens quietly at first. You wake up one day and feel slightly disconnected from routines that once felt natural. Conversations that used to energize you now leave you restless. Goals that once guided you no longer feel aligned. Even your reflection feels like someone you're in the process of outgrowing. Change rarely arrives with clarity. It arrives with questions. Why doesn't this feel right anymore? Why am I craving something different? Why do I feel a pull toward things I never cared about before? Why am I afraid to admit that I'm changing? These questions mark the beginning of a transformation you can feel, but cannot yet describe. And because change unfolds slowly, it often feels like confusion rather than growth. People talk about becoming yourself as if it is a single moment, a breakthrough, a decision, an awakening. But in reality, becoming yourself is a continuous process of shedding old versions and stepping into new ones. The challenge is not in the changing, but in allowing yourself to change. Allowing change is difficult because you've spent years building an identity based on who you believed you needed to be. The responsible one, the reliable one, the focused one, the calm one, the person others could count on. You build a life around the expectations you inherited, the habits you adopted, and the choices that once made sense. But even identities built with care can become too small. People often feel guilty when they begin to change, as if evolution means ingratitude. You worry that shifting your priorities means betraying your past. You fear that wanting something new invalidates everything you once believed. You hesitate to grow because the world around you has grown comfortable with your current shape. But growth is not betrayal, and wanting something different is not a dismissal of what was. It is simply the next truth emerging. When you feel the pull toward change, it usually means you have outgrown the emotional framework that once held you. It means you've learned the lessons you were meant to learn in that season. It means the desires you once silenced are finally strong enough to be heard. It means the person you are becoming is ready to step forward. Yet many people resist this, not because they don't want change, but because they fear what it might cost. You fear disappointing people who expect you to stay the same. You fear losing relationships that were built on earlier versions of you. You fear stepping into a future that lacks guarantees. You fear leaving behind a comfort that turned into confinement. This fear is natural. Change threatens the stability you've worked so hard to create. It challenges the identity you've invested years into maintaining. It pushes you into uncertainty. But the deeper truth is this: what feels like uncertainty is often the space you need in order to grow. The old version of you is not wrong. It is simply complete. And your next chapter is waiting for permission. Permission you can only give yourself. Letting yourself change is not about becoming someone new overnight. It is about noticing the subtle signs that the life you're living no longer matches the person you're becoming. It is about honoring the whispers of your inner world before they turn into a quiet ache. It is about giving space to the parts of you that want to emerge. It is about trusting that your evolution is not a disruption. It is a continuation. The moment you admit you are changing, a new kind of honesty begins to take shape inside you. It is gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if it's checking whether you're truly ready to listen. This honesty doesn't demand anything. It doesn't judge who you've been. It simply asks you to see yourself with clarity. And clarity, when it arrives, is rarely dramatic. Sometimes it comes as a quiet awareness. I don't enjoy this the way I used to. This relationship feels different now. I've grown past this environment. I need something new, but I'm scared to reach for it. Other times it arrives as discomfort, a restlessness you cannot explain, a heaviness in a place that used to feel light, a sense that you're performing a life that no longer reflects what's inside you. If you ignore this discomfort, it doesn't go away. It grows. It spreads. It settles into your days like a subtle pressure that something is missing. This pressure is not a flaw. It is a message. It is your inner world letting you know that you are ready to evolve. But because letting yourself change often disrupts familiar patterns, many people respond to this message with resistance. You try to convince yourself to stay the same. You hold tightly to old routines. You surround yourself with things that once grounded you. You do everything you can to maintain stability. But stability built on self-denial never lasts. You may temporarily silence the voice that urges you to grow, but it will return, not to punish you, but to remind you that outgrowing things is a natural part of being human. What no one tells you is that change often brings grief, even when you're stepping into something better, even when you are moving towards something truer. You grieve the familiar version of yourself. You grieve the comfort of knowing what to expect. You grieve the relationships that cannot grow with you. You grieve the dreams you once held dearly, but no longer desire. Grief is not a sign that change is wrong. It is a sign that you cared about the version you're leaving behind. And caring is never wasted. As you allow yourself to change, you begin to see that the parts of you that once felt essential were simply stepping stones, necessary for that chapter, but not required for all the chapters ahead. You are not betraying your past by moving forward. You are honoring it by continuing to grow. Letting yourself change also means accepting that you may not always have a clear picture of who you're becoming. Some phases of life are about defining yourself. Others are about discovering yourself. And some are about letting go of definitions altogether. You don't need to know your destination to take the next step. You don't need a plan to acknowledge what no longer fits. You don't need approval to follow your inner truth. Growth does not require certainty. It requires honesty. And honesty often begins with simple admissions. I want something different. I'm not the same person anymore. I need to let this version of me go. The beauty of change is that it creates space. Space for new desires, new connections, new clarity, new versions of yourself that you have not yet met. You begin to realize that the fear of change is often worse than the change itself. Fear imagines every possible loss. Change, when embraced, reveals every possible expansion. And expansion is what happens when you stop fighting who you're becoming. One of the most transformative moments in life is when you begin to understand that changing does not mean something is wrong with you. It means something is awakening. You start noticing parts of yourself that were quiet before. You start sensing desires that once felt distant or impossible. You begin to recognize that the life you built earlier was built from the knowledge, courage, and clarity you had at the time. And now, you have more of all three. This new awareness can feel fragile. You may question whether the change is real or temporary. You may wonder if you're being impulsive. You may fear that admitting you've outgrown something makes you ungrateful. But you cannot grow without outgrowing something. Every chapter of your life demands a different version of you. Some chapters require resilience. Others require softness. Some require ambition. Others require rest. Some require patience. Others require boldness. You do not stay the same because life does not stay the same. Everything shifts: your priorities, your values, your hopes, your boundaries, your understanding of what truly matters. And as these shifts occur, you either evolve with them or cling tightly to a version of yourself that feels increasingly distant. The truth is, staying the same requires more energy than allowing yourself to grow. It takes effort to pretend you enjoy what you've outgrown. It takes effort to stay loyal to routines that drain you. It takes effort to maintain relationships built on earlier versions of yourself. It takes effort to silence new desires out of fear of change. It takes effort to live in a life that no longer fits the person you're becoming. And eventually, pretending becomes too heavy to carry. This is when small acts of truth begin to surface. You start saying no to things you once said yes to without thinking. You start asking yourself what you want instead of what is expected. You start listening to your discomfort instead of brushing it aside. You start noticing joy in places you never looked before. You start wanting to create a life that feels aligned, not just acceptable. These small acts are not random. They are the early signs that you are ready to expand. And expansion often begins with a single brave acknowledgement: I am changing, and that is allowed. Once you give yourself permission to evolve, the world around you begins to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. You begin to attract conversations that resonate with your new truth. You start finding people who understand the direction you're growing toward. You begin noticing opportunities that match who you are becoming rather than who you were. Change calls people, environments, and experiences into your life that align with your newer self. But this alignment only happens when you stop shrinking into who you used to be. The version of you who once needed approval may now crave authenticity. The version of you who once chased perfection may now long for gentleness. The version of you who once stayed silent to keep peace may now want honesty. The version of you who once prioritized stability may now desire freedom. You do not have to apologize for these desires. They are evidence that you're growing. Letting yourself change also means accepting that some people will not understand your evolution. They may expect you to be predictable. They may react when you shift your boundaries. They may miss the version of you that served their comfort more than your truth. This is not a sign to turn back. It is a sign to continue, because the people meant for your future will recognize your growth not as a threat, but as a natural expression of who you are. You do not lose the people who truly value you. You only lose the versions of them that needed you to stay small. What many people don't realize is that change often begins with subtle courage, the quiet decision to honor a feeling you used to ignore. It doesn't start with grand declarations or dramatic turning points. It starts with a single moment of honesty when you admit to yourself, I'm not the same anymore. This admission is powerful because it shifts the center of your decisions. Instead of asking, what will people think? You begin asking, what feels right for me now? Instead of worrying about disappointing the past versions of yourself, you begin focusing on supporting the version of yourself that is emerging. And when that shift happens, something else begins to change. You start allowing yourself to want more. Not more in the sense of ambition, though that may come, but more in the sense of alignment. You want relationships that feel reciprocal. You want work that reflects your values. You want rest that doesn't arrive with guilt. You want friends who meet your honesty with honesty. You want environments that support your growth instead of confining it. You want a life that feels like it's yours, not a collection of expectations you've outgrown. These desires are not excessive. They are signals of internal evolution. But the moment you allow these desires to surface, you also encounter resistance, not only from others, but from within yourself. A part of you will try to pull you back into familiarity, not because it is right, but because it is known. Safety is often confused with sameness. Your old identity will whisper things like, "Don't make things complicated. Stay where you are, it's easier. Change might cost you something important. What if you regret this?" These worries come from the mind, not the heart. The mind fears uncertainty. The heart fears stagnation. And growth always requires choosing which fear you are willing to live with. What you eventually learn is this: the fear of changing is far easier to live with than the regret of never becoming who you were meant to be. If you ignore your desire for change, it turns into self-doubt. If you suppress it, it turns into resentment. If you fight it, it turns into emotional exhaustion. But if you listen to it gently, without pressure, it turns into clarity. Clarity about what kind of life resonates with your inner truth. Clarity about the people who support your growth. Clarity about the habits that need to be released. Clarity about the path you're ready to walk toward. Letting yourself change isn't about rushing into a new identity. It's about allowing your inner world to shift without forcing it back into the shape it once had. It means trusting that you're allowed to evolve without having every answer. It means giving your future self the permission to define what happiness looks like now. It means recognizing that you can love who you were and still outgrow the life that version of you built. And here is the part no one tells you. When you let yourself change, you don't lose yourself. You return to yourself. You return to the instincts you buried. You return to the voice you muted. You return to the dreams you postponed. You return to the courage you forgot you had. This returning is not regression. It is awakening. The most authentic parts of you never disappear. They wait patiently for the moment you decide that your evolution matters more than your fear. As you continue to open yourself to change, you begin to experience a different kind of peace. Not the peace that comes from keeping everything predictable, but the peace that comes from finally moving in rhythm with who you truly are. It is a steady, grounded feeling, even when the path ahead is uncertain. It is the feeling of being aligned with your inner world instead of fighting against it. This peace does not appear all at once. It appears in moments, small, surprising, unmistakable moments. You feel it the first time you say yes to something that excites you instead of something that simply fits your routine. You feel it when you make a decision that reflects your evolving values rather than your old fears. You feel it when you set a boundary, not to push anyone away, but to protect the person you're becoming. You feel it when you choose growth, even though staying the same would be easier. With each moment, you reclaim a part of yourself that drifted away when you were busy surviving, adapting, or pleasing. And you begin to understand that change is not a rejection of who you once were. It is the honoring of who you are capable of becoming. But embracing this transformation also requires patience. Not everyone around you will understand it immediately. Some will feel unsettled by your new boundaries. Some will question your new choices. Some will cling to the version of you that made their lives comfortable. This discomfort is not a reason to stop. It is a sign that you are shifting out of old dynamics that were built on your self-sacrifice rather than your self-awareness. The relationships that matter will adapt with you. The ones that can't were built on a foundation that was never meant to last. And through it all, you will learn one of the most important truths about change. You are allowed to evolve faster than others can adjust. Your growth does not require permission. Your evolution does not need validation. Your path does not have to align with what others expect of you. Once this truth settles in your heart, you no longer fear becoming someone new. You no longer hold on to outdated versions of yourself because they make others comfortable. You no longer shrink to fit the life you've already lived. Instead, you begin to expand, gently, honestly, naturally. You start making decisions based on who you're becoming rather than who you've been. You start creating emotional space for your future self. You start imagining a life that feels more honest, more spacious, more aligned. You stop treating change as something to fear and begin treating it as a part of your becoming. And in this slow, steady process, you realize something profound. The person you are becoming is not replacing the person you were. She is completing her. Every version of you has led to this moment. Every choice, every lesson, every heartbreak, every victory. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was meaningless. They were all steps toward a truth that is only now beginning to reveal itself. Letting yourself change is one of the greatest acts of self-respect. It is the recognition that you deserve a life that reflects who you are now, not who you once were, not who others want you to be, and not who fear convinces you to remain. You are not betraying your past. You are simply honoring your future. And the moment you embrace that, you step into a life where growth feels less like a disruption and more like a homecoming, a gentle, undeniable return to the person you were always meant to become. Essay 6. The moments you were allowed to break. There are moments in life when the strength you've practiced for years begins to crack. So quietly at first that only you can feel it. You tell yourself you're just tired. You tell yourself you're being dramatic. You tell yourself that you can push through, like you always do. But somewhere beneath those familiar assurances is a truth you've been avoiding. You are reaching a limit you've ignored for far too long. Everyone learns, in one way or another, to hold themselves together. You learn to stay composed in public. You learn to keep your voice steady. You learn to smile even when something inside you feels heavy. You learn to keep moving because stopping feels dangerous or selfish or too vulnerable. These habits become so ingrained that breaking feels like failure. But breaking is not failure. Breaking is honesty. The moments when you break, even just a little, are not signs of weakness. They are signs that you've been strong in silence for too long. They are moments when your body, your mind, and your heart speak in unison, saying, "I cannot hold all of this alone anymore." These are the moments you were allowed to break, not because you lost control, but because something inside you needed release more than it needed perfection. Breaking looks different for everyone. For some, it's a sudden burst of tears in the bathroom, the kind you didn't see coming. For others, it's lying awake at night with a mind that won't quiet down, even though your body is exhausted. Sometimes it's feeling numb instead of overwhelmed, because numbness is easier than facing everything at once. Sometimes it's snapping at someone you love, not out of anger, but out of emotional depletion. Sometimes it's feeling completely disconnected from your own life, as if you're watching yourself move through routines you no longer recognize. These moments can feel confusing, even frightening. You wonder why you can't handle things the way you used to. You wonder why everything feels heavier than it should. You wonder why your strength suddenly feels unreliable. But cracks don't appear out of nowhere. They appear in places that carry too much for too long. And life has a way of revealing those cracks when you have reached a threshold you didn't even know you were approaching. What makes these moments even more complicated is that many people have been conditioned to hide their breaking points. Somewhere along the way, you learned that vulnerability made you inconvenient. You learned that showing emotion could burden others. You learned that collapsing, even internally, was something to avoid at all costs. Maybe you grew up in a family that valued composure. Maybe you learned early that emotions made people uncomfortable. Maybe you became the one others relied on, so you convinced yourself you had no room to fall apart. Maybe you believed that as long as you stayed strong, things around you would stay intact. But strength without softness becomes strain, and strain always finds a way to show itself. These moments of breaking aren't failures of character. They are moments of truth. They are reminders that you are human, not a machine. They are signals that you have been carrying more than anyone realized, including you. They are opportunities for release, not shame. Yet many people don't know what to do when these moments come. You might hide them. You might minimize them. You might carry them alone because you don't want to worry anyone. You might patch yourself up quickly, determined to return to being fine. But every moment you were allowed to break was also a moment you were allowed to be held by someone, by rest, by honesty, by yourself. These moments matter not because they expose your fragility, but because they reveal your humanity. What makes breaking so difficult is not the breaking itself, but the story you've attached to it. Somewhere along the way, you learn to equate composure with strength. You learned that the people who seemed unshakable were the ones who earned respect. You learned that being the strong one meant being the one who handled everything without hesitation, without complaint, without faltering. So when the moment comes where your strength gives way, even slightly, your first instinct is often self-blame. Why am I like this? Why can't I handle things better? Why am I falling apart over something so small? What's wrong with me? But nothing is wrong with you. You are simply meeting yourself in a moment where pretending is no longer an option. Breaking becomes painful only when you believe it should never happen, when you shame yourself for struggling, when you demand perfection from a heart that has been doing its best, when you treat your own needs as inconveniences. The truth is, breaking is one of the most honest things you can do. It strips away the performance. It quiets the expectations. It reveals the emotional weight you've been hiding beneath your calm exterior. And in that rawness, something important emerges: your truth. Your truth might be that you're overwhelmed. Your truth might be that you've been pretending to be okay for too long. Your truth might be that you need rest, support, softness, or a moment to exhale. Your truth might simply be that you are human, and humans break sometimes. You were never meant to move through life untouched by difficulty. You were meant to feel deeply, to process, to collapse occasionally, to rebuild, to be real. But acknowledging this truth requires a kind of courage that doesn't look like the strength you're used to. It requires a softer courage, a quieter one. It is the courage to say, I can't carry all of this alone anymore. I need help. I'm tired in ways I haven't said out loud. I need a moment to fall apart so I can breathe again. These sentences feel frightening because they expose the part of you that has been hidden for years. But they also open the door to the kind of healing that composure can never provide. Breaking, when done with honesty, becomes a release instead of a collapse. It is the moment your inner world stops pretending. It is the moment your body stops holding tension that was never meant to stay. It is the moment your spirit asks to be seen. It is the moment something inside you says, let me rest. And rest, in this context, is not laziness. It is repair. Yet many people have never been taught how to rest emotionally. You learn how to push, how to endure, how to stay strong. But you were not taught how to crumble safely. You were not taught how to soften without feeling ashamed. You were not taught how to express your breaking without fearing it would make you unlovable. So when the moment comes where breaking feels inevitable, it feels like losing control. But in reality, it is a form of letting go. Letting go of the emotional armor. Letting go of impossible expectations. Letting go of the pressure to be perfect. Letting go of the belief that you must always be the one who holds everything together. Breaking is not the end of your strength. It is the beginning of a new kind of strength, the kind that comes from truth instead of pressure. There's a different kind of strength that appears only after you allow yourself to break. It doesn't come with force. It doesn't come with urgency. It doesn't arrive as a sudden burst of clarity. It comes slowly, almost quietly, like light entering a room through a door you finally opened after keeping it closed for far too long. This strength is not about endurance. It is about honesty. It is the strength that comes when you stop pretending you're untouched by the weight you carry. It is the strength that comes when you stop demanding resilience from parts of yourself that are asking for gentleness. It is the strength that emerges when you finally let your heart speak after silencing it for years. This strength cannot be accessed through pressure. It can only be accessed through truth. But before that truth can arrive, you must first face the discomfort of breaking, the discomfort of admitting you are overwhelmed, the discomfort of showing emotion, the discomfort of letting people see the parts of you that you've spent your whole life protecting. These moments feel vulnerable because they expose a version of you that does not fit the image you've spent years maintaining. They reveal the side of you that doesn't have all the answers, doesn't have everything under control, doesn't always know how to stay steady. But this version of you deserves compassion, not shame. Breaking moments are often the only times you allow yourself to be real. They pull away the polished surface and reveal the tenderness underneath. The part of you that needs comfort, understanding, and permission to simply exist without performing strength. It is this version of you that needs to be acknowledged, because ignoring your breaking point doesn't protect you. It fractures you quietly, day by day. When you finally allow yourself to break, something shifts. You stop measuring your worth by how well you can endure pain. You stop believing that emotional collapse is a sign of failure. You stop treating vulnerability as a weakness to hide. You stop carrying the expectation that you must be invincible. And in that moment, a new truth begins to settle in your heart. You are allowed to need support. You are allowed to fall apart without explaining yourself. You are allowed to cry without apologizing for it. You are allowed to feel overwhelmed without feeling guilty. You are allowed to stop being the strong one all the time. But perhaps the most important realization of all is this: you are allowed to be cared for. For someone who has spent their life being the anchor, being cared for can feel foreign. It can feel uncomfortable to let someone hold space for your emotions. It can feel strange to lean on others after years of carrying everything alone. You may even feel undeserving at first, as if you need to earn comfort, earn compassion, earn the right to be taken care of. But you do not need to earn rest. You do not need to earn softness. You do not need to earn the right to break. These things are not rewards. They are human needs. And when you begin accepting them, something inside you heals, slowly, meaningfully, without asking you to rush. You learn to breathe again without feeling like every breath must be steady. You learn to speak without filtering everything through strength. You learn to exist without performing emotional perfection. You learn to show up as a whole person, not just the resilient one. Breaking is not the opposite of strength. It is the moment strength becomes truthful. There is a certain clarity that rises only after you've allowed yourself to break. It's not a sudden revelation. not a dramatic shift. It's gentler than that. It comes as a steady understanding, a recognition that the version of you who always held everything together was not the full story. You start to see the difference between strength and suppression. You start to notice the places where endurance turned into self-neglect. You begin to recognize the emotional weight you've been carrying for so long that you forgot it was heavy. Breaking gives you the perspective you never had while pretending you were fine. It shows you the pressure you placed on yourself. Pressure that didn't come from failure, but from the misguided belief that handling everything alone made you admirable. It reveals the unrealistic expectations you've internalized. It helps you notice how much of your identity was built on the necessity of being composed. When you break, the part of you that has been whispering for years finally becomes audible. It says, I am tired. I need space to feel. I need kindness, especially for myself. I can't carry everything anymore. These admissions are not weakness. They are wisdom. Breaking is not the collapse of your strength. It is the collapse of your armor. And armor, as protective as it may seem, eventually becomes too heavy to wear every day. Once you begin to see this, you start asking new questions you didn't have the permission or awareness to ask before. What do I need right now? Who am I beyond the roles I play for others? Where did I learn that vulnerability is dangerous? Why do I feel guilty when I feel overwhelmed? These questions open something inside you, something that was always yours but was covered by the need to stay strong. For many people, breaking becomes the moment when self-compassion is finally possible, not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because you stop demanding perfection from yourself. You stop treating exhaustion as a personal flaw. You stop believing that your emotions must be hidden. Instead, you begin to meet yourself with gentleness, the kind of gentleness that allows you to slow down without feeling guilty, the kind of gentleness that gives you room to breathe instead of pushing through, the kind of gentleness that sees your pain without judging it, the kind of gentleness that acknowledges how long you've been holding on. And slowly, you realize something essential. You did not break because you were weak. You broke because you were carrying too much alone. When you understand this, the shame you once felt begins to fade. You stop blaming yourself. You stop minimizing your emotions. You stop pretending that strength means silence. You stop believing that you must earn the right to be human. This is when breaking becomes transformation. Through the cracks, truth enters. Through the cracks, understanding enters. Through the cracks, compassion enters. Through the cracks, healing enters. And once healing begins, you realize that you don't have to go back to being the version of yourself who never allowed cracks to show. You can become someone softer, someone more honest, someone who doesn't apologize for needing rest, someone who lets themselves be supported, someone who no longer hides every pain behind a practiced smile. Breaking allowed the truth in. Now it allows you to rebuild. When you begin to rebuild after breaking, it does not look like returning to who you were before. It looks like becoming someone who has learned from every fracture, someone who has finally given themselves the permission to be human instead of a constant source of stability, someone who understands that strength built on exhaustion is not strength at all. Rebuilding happens slowly, sometimes so slowly you don't realize it's happening. It begins when you allow yourself to rest without guilt. It continues when you stop apologizing for needing time. It deepens when you start setting boundaries that protect your well-being. It grows when you let people see your vulnerability without hiding behind perfection. This rebuilding is not about becoming tougher. It is about becoming truer. For the first time, you begin to listen to your emotions instead of suppressing them. You begin to treat your internal signals as guidance rather than inconvenience. You begin to trust that expressing your pain does not make you burdensome, it makes you honest. And honesty, especially with yourself, becomes the foundation of real strength. You learn that the world does not fall apart when you stop being the strong one. You learn that people can show up for you if you give them the chance. You learn that your worth is not tied to how much you can endure. You learn that softness, when allowed, becomes a quiet kind of resilience. But perhaps the most meaningful change is this: breaking softens your relationship with yourself in a way nothing else can. You begin speaking to yourself differently. You begin treating yourself with the compassion you've always reserved for others. You begin seeing your needs as valid rather than inconvenient. You begin acknowledging your pain without rushing to hide it. And eventually, you realize something you were never taught but desperately needed to know. Your breaking moments were not signs that you were falling apart. They were signs that you were finally ready to stop carrying everything alone. These moments broke the illusion that you were invincible. They broke the belief that strength meant silence. They broke the patterns that kept you hidden behind composure. They broke the cycle of pushing through at the expense of your own well-being. Through these moments, you learn that your softness does not weaken you. Your tears do not diminish you. Your vulnerability does not make you fragile. They make you real. They make you open. They make you whole. And as you move forward, you no longer fear breaking, because you trust yourself now, not to avoid collapse, but to honor yourself when it happens. You understand that breaking is not the end of your strength. It is the moment your strength becomes honest, grounded, and human. You no longer measure your worth by how perfectly you hold yourself together. You measure it by how gently you treat yourself when you finally allow yourself to fall apart. And in this gentleness, in this acceptance, you discover a kind of strength that feels nothing like the strength you once performed. It feels quieter, steadier, more real. It feels like coming home to yourself. You've reached the end of this listening. These were 6 essays from the Weight You Don't Have to Carry, Book 1 from the Essays for the Human Being series by Camille Ella. If any thoughts stayed with you, you don't need to hold it tightly. If nothing stayed, that's just as enough. Let the words settle where they will. Let the silence do the rest. Thank you for spending this time here, with yourself and with Stillness Audiobook. Take a slow breath before you go. There's nothing more you need to carry with you. And one more, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.